So I am not the originator of GHS, I'm the co-originator. And one of the first things I'd like to do after I share my screen is tell you what we're going to talk about. What is generalized hyperbolic stretching? It really is a 101. I tried to set it up that way. GHS is a method of stretching your astronomical images, and it was created by myself and Mike Cranfield, who also happens to be attending tonight. So Mike's going to promise to keep me out of trouble. But I do want to give a big shout out to Mike for all the work he's done on the script and the process and the methodology. It really was a chance meeting. Put it out there that I needed help putting this together. Mike answered the call, and turns out we have very synergistic backgrounds. Not the same backgrounds, but kinds of that came together. We're both amateurs, though. We don't get any money for doing this, and we offer it up for whoever wants it. It does come with a money-back guarantee, though. So we're going to talk about the Pixinsight implementation tonight, but soon it'll be fully functional GHS in Cyril. It currently is in its development release, and I'm not sure when the Cyril guys who actually put it in Cyril are going to release it. But there it is. If you're not a Pixinsight fan, like I think most of us are. If you want a whole bunch of details, or you want whatever you want, please visit GHSAstro.co.uk. It will also send you there if you use .com or .ca. It's GHSAstro, and I'll show you the website here. And it has, oh, that's not the website. That's the website. It has a whole bunch of goodies, including how to install it. It's just really to install it, you just have to add a little line here into your resources, your repository in Pixinsight, and then do whatever you have to do, apply, exit, go back in, and it should appear there. So tonight's talk, that's the problem with putting it in Pixinsight. Tonight's talk is going to be basically in two parts. The first is going to be on understanding how it works. And this is more than just a academic exercise or knowledge-based exercise. I think it really helps in using and using the product in understanding what to do and how to control it, and when you're in a certain circumstances, what's the best thing to apply. So I'm going to spend the first part of this talk talking about that. Everything from contrast and brightness and how to change the transform and the properties of the stretch. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about a whole bunch of examples. Now I've got a whole bunch lined up, and we'll see how far we get, showing you increasingly complex examples for different kinds of images, different kinds of processes, dealing with stars, dealing with color and saturation, but we'll see how far we get along. And I hope it doesn't look like an assembly line at that point, but maybe that would be a good thing. So I'm going to start off with the simplest image I could think of, which is essentially a monochrome, single brightness pixel in an image. And I'm just going to make one little modification. I'm just going to put a reference on the left-hand side of this image and a reference on the right-hand side of this image. And I want to look at that, not just the image, but I'm going to open up GHS. Now you can find that I always go to all processes and then look alphabetically where GHS is, and that will appear in your processes when you install the program. You can also find it under intensity transformations, along with some of the other popular ones, ArcSine, and histogram, and all stuff like that. The other place you'll find it is in the scripts, though. Now, the scripts, under scripts utilities, you'll find generalized hyperbolic stretch there too. Now, the whole system started off as a script only, and it's still there because it really provides a lot more structure to using GHS than perhaps the process does. There's nothing you can't do in the process that you can do, but it provides a little bit more customization options. But one of the things about scripts, of course, is before you do anything else, you have to exit the script. And I find using the process much simpler. And I tend to have it open a lot of the time when I'm doing my processing, if for nothing else, just to look at the histogram. Now I've opened up the program here, and I don't know if it's too small for you to see the numbers or the fonts or not on your screen that you're watching it. I've tried changing the resolution, and that can work, but it causes some other issues. So I decided that I will tell you when there's a number there. You don't necessarily have to read it. Most of the things I'm going to be doing are with mouse clicks anyways. Makes life easier. But I'm going to first show the histogram of this plot, and I'm not sure why it's not coming up. Screen. If I try this one. Oh, yes, it is coming up on the screen. Just happens to be so I'm showing the histogram for this pixel that I've got here. Now, hopefully we're all somewhat familiar with histograms and how they work. And for this screen here, I'm just showing the histogram, and it so happens that all the pixels in this image are right set at 0.5. Now, there is a little band at 0 and a little band at right, referring to my references. Now, these references work this for just a second. These references represent absolute 0 in terms of brightness, and the maximum brightness that your monitor or your eyes or whatever's limiting it here can perceive. Now, by normalizing the pixel values in your image, this brightness becomes a 1 inside Pixinsight. And I can actually see that by putting my cursor over it, and then at the bottom it tells me it's a 1. And at the other side, it tells me it's a 0. Now, the reason why this is not a limitation of your eyes, you could probably see something brighter by looking at a light bulb or something brighter than that, but that's the most that your monitor feels it could show you. You could recalibrate your monitor or whatever, but 1 is supposed to represent the brightest that something can be, and 0 is the darkest. And I've picked a spot right in the middle. But I can change that. I can move it over to the right, I can preview. I can change the brightness of that. Now it's at 0.75. And I just wanted to point out what I've done is actually moved my histogram to the right. And this happens whenever you brighten something. That's what happens on the histogram. It moves the histogram over to the right. I can move it almost all the way up to absolute brightness. And you can see it's moved further to the right. And then once I make it total brightness, you can't tell the difference between it and the reference on the left. And the histogram is actually a spike that's over to the right. All the other pixel quantities in there are zero, so you don't see them. And the opposite when you make something darker, it moves to the left. But I'm going to go back and say that now, so that's how the histogram kind of works with brightness. And I'm going to talk a little bit about contrast. Now, in here, I could say there are actually two blocks of color, but there's no contrast between them. So you can't see the difference between them. But as soon as I put some contrast in between them, you can see my histogram, clear that yellow line, that histogram forms two bars separated, one for the left on the darker side and one for on the right for the lighter side. So I've actually created this contrast by brightening one side of that block and darkening the other side of the block. And I'm starting to see some contrast in that image. Now, one thing your eyes might tell you, if you look at this image, one thing your eyes might tell you is that if you kind of block out with your hand or the part in the middle, it's kind of hard to tell which one's brighter and which one's darker. It's really easy to tell when they're up against each other. And that's a mind trick that you'll see a lot of processes make use of when you're doing your processing. I can make that contrast bigger by separating the distance between the brightness levels in the histogram. So what I'm doing is darkening one, but I'm actually, by providing contrast, I'm actually pushing the histogram apart. And if you notice, according to my reference, as I'm pushing them apart, they're actually getting closer to the left-hand side and the right-hand side. So I start reducing the contrast on this side. And then if I go a lot further, you can see that now the contrast is getting very low here and it's getting very low there. And here's the maximum contrast I can put into the image. It's absolute dark on the left, absolute dark on the right. There's no contrast between the reference. And this is all just to illustrate that while we can take any pixel in any image and brighten it all the way from 0 to 1, the maximum contrast we can put in the image is a number 1. We can split the number 1, we can put it wherever we want, but ultimately you're limited in what contrast you can, which is a bit different than you say, well, I've seen lots of sliders that say add contrast. Well, you can't actually add contrast. You can just take the contrast that exists and distribute it differently. So that'll become a little bit clearer. And I know it's a simple demo, but it'll become really clear. What I'm now showing on the generalized hyperbolic stretch histogram area is a red line, and I'm going to add back in that grid. I'm going to close this down so it's not interfering, and that for some reason resizes. But this is the transform that is proposed I have proposed by setting the various parameters. There's 5 important ones down here. These 5 parameters have created this transform. And I can describe it and let you know how it works in 2 different ways. The first way involves brightness. So if I, and the way it works is for any pixel brightness going into the stretch, I read up to wherever the red line is, and the height of the red line above that brightness tells me how the brightness will be for that same pixel after the stretch. For this straight line, it shows that for any input I can think of along this brightness curve, it'll give me the exact same brightness back out. For that reason, this is called the identity stretch and is a straight line that goes from the lower left corner to the upper left corner. Now, if I actually get my 1 pixel out again and I give it, say, a low value. Where's my 1 pixel astro? Here we go. Here it is. This is the one I want to use. You could say that a typical astro image looks something like that. If I were to pick a typical pixel, its histogram is way over on the left and it's dark. So how do I perform a stretch and make it brighter so I can see it better? Well, using the transform or the stretch that I've got here, it'll just give the same pixel out. So on a preview of what I'm doing, it'll look exactly the same as what I'm putting in. Now, there are 5 parameters, and I just want to focus on the top parameter here. Now, in the script, you see it's called stretch factor. It could have been called stretch amount, and Mike and I went debating what we should call these things. But really, I call it big D for daddy, because it's the daddy of all the other parameters. Now, I'm not trying to be sexist here. The D actually comes from a different formulation of these equations, so I couldn't make it mummy, but just think of it as capital D, and I'll be referring to it. So to perform a stretch on this pixel, I start to move. It starts at 0, and whenever it's 0, I'll get this. When big D for daddy is 0, I'll always get this identity transform. As I increase D, you'll see I start to stretch that pixel. What I'm doing is brightening it, and as we just learned, I'm moving it to the right. But what happens with this transform? Well, I don't want to move the 0 point, because I can't make it lower, because I can't make it darker than 0. And I don't want to raise that 0 point, because I don't want to lose, I'd start losing the maximum contrast I have available to me. At the same time, I can't raise the brightest pixels. I can't rate their brightness anymore. And I don't want to lower it for the same reason, is I'll start to lose the contrast. So for any stretch you'll see GHS do, they'll always start at that lower left-hand corner and end up on the right. So the only way I can make a pixel brighter than this line is to make the stretch bendy. And that makes it nonlinear, and hence the name nonlinear. So I can do that nonlinear stretch. So now I can show my original pixel value, and I can place that pixel. Let's say we want to place it right there. So now I've brightened it up. If you see the original image, my stretched image looks below. I can see that pixel fine now. So I took my value from my pixel, read up to right up to where the red line exists. It says it's at 0.25, and at 0.25, that's where my new pixel lies. So that's how you read this in terms of brightness. If you want to say how much did I brighten the pixel, well, that's given by the distance between my red line and my original identity line. The further to the right I go, it will make the pixels brighter, but it can't make it, it's limited to how bright it can make it, because it has to make this turn and end up in the right corner. It looks flat out here, but it really isn't. It's really just hugging this and can't reach one until it actually makes it up here. If you think of it as a hill, this is a slow climb up, a steady climb up the hill. This is taking the steep parts first and then moving out. And that's going to be helpful in understanding how this works in terms of contrast. So in terms of contrast, I have a slightly different image I want to use. And that's this one here. So let me change this. What I've done here, and I can define this image not using brightness at all. All I can say is I'm going to start off and make 11 bands in total, but bands that are 0.1 difference in contrast between each other. So that histogram shows here. I'm going to just hide this for a second. So what I'm going to describe here is the transform in terms of contrast levels. Now you can imagine any two pixels that are pretty close to one another at this end of the scale. They're going to result in much bigger difference in the brightness coming out of this transform. Two pixels beside each other at this end of the transform are going to end up being, that are fairly close to each other, are going to be really close to each other because their brightness isn't going to be changed very much in comparison. So if you look at the steepness of this slope, or the amount of incline or the rise over run of this slope, that's how it's redistributing the contrast. Now it has to end up at 1, 1. So as it travels from left to right, you can see it increasingly changes its pointing back to 1. So in here, this level is the same slope as my identity line. So I'm going to be adding contrast. It's a much larger slope than my identity line. So I'm going to be adding a lot more contrast here. Somewhere in the middle, it's about the same. So the contrast that's going to be put in the image at this level is going to be about the same as the identity line. I had no change in contrast. And then up at the high end, I'm going to be changing contrast very little, and much taking it away from my original image. So really what this stretch is doing is taking contrast away from the bright areas and putting it into the dark areas of the histogram. Now we can see that by opening that image that I just closed. Which I lost. I'll create it again. Now you can see each of those bands appears as a spike. I'll zero this. Each of those bands appears as a spike along my histogram. Now, as I add stretch, you'll see I'm moving all the spikes to the right. So I'm brightening every band that's in there, but I'm brightening the darkest bands more than the brightest bands. So I'm adding contrast on the left-hand side of this image and taking it away from the right-hand side of this image. And as I increase my stretch, I need to show the preview. Go back a second. As I increase the stretch, you see I'm actually taking contrast away from this side and adding contrast down here. I'm brightening everything as I do that. And I can get to a point where, hey, I brightened this right-hand side so much that I can't see any contrast in there at all, but I'm put a lot of contrast down here. So what I've, to further illustrate that, what I've put together is one banded image. I put it together, a banded image. I'm going to try and put this at the top and bring this down below. That's more representative of what you might find in the grayscale of an astro image. So what we have is a lot of, we have very dark pixels, and most of our pixels are very dark, and we have some very bright pixels. We have brighter pixels. These would be more like the stars in our image. And what I want to do is stretch this image. You can see a lot of contrast in the brights and very little contrast down here in the darks. And so this is the opposite of what we were doing. So let's hope that this gives us a better image, better view into our astro image. So I'm going to take the preview and start adding our big D for daddy parameter by sliding it to the right. This is the equivalent of sliding the histogram transform middle slider to the left. And you can see, indeed, I can add a whole bunch of contrast to the dark parts of this image, but at the same time, I'm losing any visibility up here. So I can actually really what I would like to do for this particular image is I want to change the degree of stretching that I'm taking up here and change it to and stretch this a little more and stretch this a little less. I want to leave some more contrast up here and add a little contrast down here. Now, fortunately, we have another parameter, and I'm going to talk about the second parameter, and it's little b for baby here, and it changes the shape of this curve. So I'm going to initially bring this down a little bit, and to something more reasonable, and change this. It's just a distraction right now. Put this, if I can find it. Looking at the shape of the curve, I'm going to put a fairly decent stretch here. Now, by changing B, it starts initially at 0. By sliding it to the right, you can see it changes the parameters that go into the general hyperbolic equations. And you can see it actually does exactly what I was talking about. So it actually leaves some contrast in the upper end. Maybe I should make that bigger. Start off with a little bit higher stretch. It changes the shape so that initially you can see it come down up in the high levels, leaving some contrast for the stars, not brightening them up quite so much, and actually starts pushing this part of the curve up. And then it starts intensifying the stretch right at this 0 part, right on the left-hand side. So if we go back to our image that we were trying to stretch here, add some stretch, and then increase my B factor, little b for baby. And you can see now, as I go on the right-hand side, I've reached a point where I can still see contrast on the right-hand side. And I can actually get a fair, decent amount of contrast on the left-hand side. Along our way, going from 0 to 15 on B, we passed a couple of significant points. One is when B is equal to 1, that's the histogram transform. That's the midtones transfer function. Oh, like one in there. That we use with the histogram stretch all the time. So when it's at 0 to begin with, that's known as an exponential stretch. It's just a name, but it's actually the broadest stretch, and we'll see that in a few minutes, that we have available. So I just want to make sure I'm not missing something. So we fixed that problem by giving you some more flexibility on the shape of the curve. The next thing I briefly want to show is a gradient, a full gradient on this plot. Well, that's not. So this is basically every pixel along is given an incrementally larger brightness running from left to right. So I just wanted to show this because the histogram shows up as a color. Mike, can you help me why I'm not seeing this shaded in? Anyways, you'll see that the histogram is now a line that runs across the top. Maybe I'm stuck on a different. Oh, that's why I'm still doing a stretch. So the histogram is all gradient. It's essentially a line that runs across the top. So you can see, I wanted to show this so you can see what happens when I add D. You see, indeed, I'm shifting my pixels, my histogram is being shifted to the right. And the contrast is actually lowering the amount of pixels that are also on the left-hand side and raising the number of pixels that are far from it, because there's lots of pixels. These pixels tend to run away from the 0 point where I'm adding a lot of contrast. Now, as I add B to this, I'm going to add a little bit more D first. You can see what happens in the image. I'm brightening the whole image. I'm adding a whole bunch of contrast down here, taking it away from up here. Then as I add B, I'm continuing to add contrast right at the 0 point. I'm sort of taking it away up this. Is hard to see because this is a linear image. But you can see what happens to the shape of the histogram. Now we'll be revisiting this in a few minutes, but that's enough of theory for now. I want to I need to show you one more parameter before we go. So one thing I found limiting about the stretch functions is they were all focusing on putting the maximum contrast at the 0 line. So that's where I was always adding the most amount of contrast. If you go to the histogram transform and move that to the right of the middle point in the middle slider on the histogram transform, you will see that what you do is the equivalent of moving this third input all the way to the right. And what happens then is the stretch becomes a compression, if you will. The whole image is darkened. And what I've done is taken the point of maximum steepness, the point of maximum contrast add, and I've changed it from 0 point and I've changed it to the 1 point. So now that 1 point is the place where the maximum contrast is added. Now, the way we formulated GHS is you can put that point of maximum contrast anywhere you want along the brightness scale. So I can put it way to the right. I can actually put it right in the middle. Now, if I bring that preview up, I bring that preview up by moving it to the right, you can see I'm changing the point where the maximum contrast is. If I increase this amount of stretch, you can see I'm actually putting a lot of contrast right in the middle of my spectrum, and I'm taking almost all the contrast away from the left and right hand side. So it almost appears like a blurry line in the middle. And in fact, I can really refine that line by putting a whole bunch of contrast right in the middle. And of course, I can move that back and forth to wherever I want in the image. And you might say, well, why would I want to do that? So I'm going to show you a quick example of why I want to do that. Oh, let me lower this back again. You see what this particular setting does is it creates a valley in my histogram. And with my B set very near 0, I create a wide valley. It's stretching almost the entire image. When I start increasing my B value, it's kind of U-shaped. When I increase my B value, I can decrease this, it becomes more V-shaped rather than a U. Like I'm also allowed for negative B factors. Now, what a negative B does, I'm going to show it at 0 first. Show it below 0 first. Sorry. Is it provides a stretch, but now B, instead of helping D by adding a whole bunch of contrast in this area and taking away from here, it essentially tries to push the contrast back towards the initial identity line. So this is good for gentle stretches over the entire image, but it is focused at my SP point, because when I put it in the middle, it creates even more of a V. But if I put D here, you can see now it's creating a real spike down where I'm adding the contrast as those pixels are pushed to one side or the other. Now that may mean nothing. Why would I want to use this? I do have an example. It's an artificial example. No, not that one. This one. But it kind of illustrates what I'm talking about. Let me get rid of these. Let's say we come across an image that looks like this, and you'll see this. This is an exaggerated case, of course, but you'll see this sometimes when you stretch an image. You'll see that there's a whole area in your image where there's not a lot of contrast. There's not a lot going on, and it's humdrum and boring, and you know, all the contrast is at the far ends of the image, And so you want to add some contrast right in the middle of the image. Well, I can find out where that is by clicking on the image, and it'll show me exactly where that point is in my histogram. And indeed, it's where that bump is in the histogram. What's going on here? It's where that bump is in the histogram. And whenever you see a histogram and you see a bump on it, you can tell, well, pixel brightnesses are gathering there, and that's where you want to add some contrast. So what I want to do there, in this case, is I want to make SP at that point. So I can do that by clicking on the image, or I can click on the histogram and it'll tell me where that is. I can put that down. I got to send to SP. So it's going to take that value that it finds there and pop that into SP. So that's where I'm going to add the most contrast in this image. Now, instead of creating a valley, when I add my stretch, and I'll look at it in log view for a second. When I add my stretch, you can see I'm actually flattening out that bump. If I look at what's happening in my preview of that image, you can see I'm putting a lot of the contrast back in. And I can play with B a little bit and now really get it quite level across the edges. I can apply that, and you can see now I've restored the contrast pretty close to what it was originally. So these are the three parameters that the main parameters that we bring to a stretch. So now we're going to apply this to a real image here. I'm going to apply this to a real image here. And this is what it kind of looks like sort of after my image integration. Why is it? Isn't it a lot? The backup image. So this is what the image might look like when you first open up GHS. It's mainly dark. I can see a little bit in here, but it's a narrowband image of the Heart and Soul Nebula. Now, where's my histogram? Well, it's actually, I have to zoom into the histogram, and there's a quick zoom that goes 250 times. And I can see that my histogram is far on the left of the entire histogram range. So I've zoomed in on the far left-hand side, and I can see where it is. So if I were just to do a histogram transfer stretch, I would have to set B to 1 to be equivalent. I would start increasing my stretch factor, and what I'd start to see is the histogram shift to the right. Now I have the ability to show what the original histogram, as well as the one that I'm changing, looks like on the view. So as I'm adding my stretch, you can see I'm starting to shift the histogram to the right, and I'm actually putting contrast in the histogram as well. You can see it start to spread apart. So I can keep doing that, and it's going to disappear on my zoom screen. I can do a minus here, and then continue the stretch, and you'll start to be able to see it. And I know SDF likes to park it at the peak at 0.25, and I can do that and look at the result. Everything's misbehaving today. And that's a decent result, and it's very close to what I would get just by taking my image and applying STF. So before I do that, I'm just going to make a clone of this. I'm going to apply my stretch to it. And let's call this one B equals 1 or B1. So it's not a bad stretch. I mean, I'm getting the background, some light into it. I'm maybe overdoing the stars a little bit, but let's see what happens when I first make use of that B number. So I'm going to close this, reset. Now I'm going to set my B all the way up to 15, as high as it will go, and redo this exercise. Now, again, I zoom back in. Now, normally, the histograms show up just like a normal view of a histogram. And I liken this to looking at like a cityscape from a distance. But I prefer using the log view, which is more like going downtown in the city and looking up and around the buildings. I don't just see the skyscrapers, I now see the small buildings, because it exaggerates those bins that have few pixels in them and sort of de-exaggerates the very full bins that resulted in spikes in my histogram view. So you can see before I do the stretch that there are actual pixels pretty much throughout the histogram. There's just very few and sparsely there. But again, I can turn this off if we like that view more. But I'm going to start adding at my plus 15 B for baby, and I'm going to start adding my D. And again, I see the histograms start to move to the right. Now, it doesn't appear that I'm actually making this apart as much as I did before. So I'll just keep stretching this to the right and zoom back out and parking it. Well, I'll bring the preview out so you can see it actually come into view as I'm doing the stretch, and park it at the same place right there. Now you say, oh, well, that's not better. Why am I doing this? Why am I doing this? I've increased the background brightness quite a bit from my original stretch. And furthermore, you know, it does not making everything pop. There's a lack of contrast in the image, albeit it has done a better job on my stars. Well, this is where the third parameter comes in. So I'm going to take the stretch away, zoom back in, and really where I want to add contrast, where I did add contrast when I was stretching it out, you'll see that I ended up adding contrast where this is steepest. I ended up adding it mainly behind my histogram peak. Right? That's not where I really want it. I want that maximum contrast in my histogram peak. So I can click on this histogram peak, find out pretty much where it is. It tells me a number. It's a very, very small number because I'm zoomed in and I'm still far to the left. And I can make that my SP number. So I can make SP, by moving SP here, I can make this transform put the maximum contrast right where my histogram peak was. Now, SP stands for symmetry point here, but the P means that it's a point on here, and symmetry because you can see that the stretch is actually symmetrical about that SP point. But the point I really want to make is now I've put it, if I bring this back, and I bring this back, I've put, as I increase the slider, you can see now I'm really widening that histogram, and I'm widening it early because of all the contrast I'm putting it in here. And now when I zoom out, I can park that histogram wherever I like. I can do it a little more and a little less. You'll see at some point, I start to divide the image into two because I'm actually adding so much contrast that I'm splitting this. You don't want to do that because it looks awful. I call that bifurcating the histogram. You don't want to do that. So maybe you want to leave it maybe a little overstretched right about there. So already you can see I've done, I think, a better job of stretching this image, and especially in terms of the stars. But the next step I want to do was, that was a very rough placement of my SP factor. So thanks to Mike, he's put this adjustment slider in the bottom. And what I can do is, it comes selected with SP. There's a little box here to use highest sensitivity. You always want to use highest sensitivity when you're using a linear image. And I can actually slightly lower and slightly raise that SP level. So here's where I've lowered it so it's behind my histogram. And as I increase it, you can see the first thing that happens is my background, where there's nothing going on, starts getting darker. And then as I continue to raise it, I start losing some of my dim stuff, but my bright stuff starts to pop out more. So this might become a matter of personal taste. What do you want your image to look like? I think it's good to show the brightness about that level. Now I do have to make a little bit of adjustment to my D because I was over brightening a little bit there. So I make an adjustment to there, and I might even consider changing my B factor, which would make it look more like, change where I'm adding contrast, make the background go back more and the stars brighter. But I think that's pretty good. So then I'm prepared to execute that. Now it's going to show me what I do if I do the stretch again. Now, that flexibility to change how the image looks at the end, the ability to control the stars better, and it also provides an ability to bring out the dim stuff better. So I can actually customize this image with my initial stretch so it looks kind of what I want it to. So before I go further, I'm going to take a little break now. Are there any big questions? It's not quite as smoothly as I was hoping using this as my presentation module. But I do want to review one thing. And before I go on to the last two parameters, which are basically two versions of the same parameter, you'll see in a second. Before there, I want to go on to some ground rules. And these were ground rules. I call them ground rules because this is what we wanted, Mike and I wanted GHS to do. And we've already talked about one, is we wanted any stretch that we are doing to run from 0, 0 to 1, 1, i.e. start in the lower left corner and end in the right corner. So that meant no clipping is going to take place. So you can do GHS in this manner all day long and you won't clip anything. We wanted the pixels always to get, we wanted the transform, the stretch, always to get higher from left to right. And this is a rule of conformal mapping in math. Really, I want I don't want to destroy the integrity of my data. So if I were to line up all the pixels, say, in terms of brightness, and then did a transform on them, well, that lineup wouldn't change. The rank ordering of brightness of the pixels won't change, no matter what stretch I do. This again is no artifacts, no noise. You can't overwork the stretch. And it is actually completely invertible. I can actually go backwards, and I'll show you this in a little bit. I can go backwards at any time. It's an analytical equation. I can get any arbitrary precision. There's no Newton iterations. There's no step loops and no masking. All of these things can give you artifacts. And it also provides for an instantaneous preview so that you can see what you're going to get before you actually apply the function. There are no jumps or bumps in the transform. It's smooth, and not only is the brightness smooth, but the contrast is added smoothly too. And that means no artifacts. And pixel brightness is the only input that this transform is taking, the original pixel brightness. It doesn't know where the pixel came from on the image. It doesn't know if it's part of a star. It doesn't know if it's part of a nebula. It doesn't know anything about this pixel other than the brightness going in. So there's no interpretation going on. And this is a beauty, but it's also a constraint somehow. So following all these rules, there's only the GHS process in Pixinsight for post-processing, the histogram transform with the middle slider only, and the arcshine transform that if you don't use it on a color image. Those are the only three processes that can make this claim. Your data is completely contains its scientific integrity by doing this sort of stretch. Not the other processes are bad. I use them all the time. They're great, but they're Jedi enhancements, if you will. They are playing games with your mind, or they're playing games with the pixels to make the image look better. But in doing them, you are adding noise or artifacts that you have to watch, and you're actually removing the scientific integrity of the data. That's a bit of a minus too, as we'll see, because sometimes you want a stretch applied to a star, but you don't want it applied to the nebulosity. Well, if they're the same brightness, the same stretch is going to be applied to them. So on to our last parameter. Again, I'm going to go back to our grayscale image here and open up histogram transform. Okay, everything's working tickety-boo so far. And let's say I wanted to add some contrast. Oh, that's not SP. I wanted to move SP. I wanted to add some contrast here. I'm just picking a spot. I can pick it on the image and then say that's where I want to add the contrast. And I want to use an arbitrary B factor. So I know from SP is here, that's the point where I'm adding the most contrast. But as you can see in relation to the identity line, that's actually dimming that particular pixel. So the bottom of the valley I created is actually shifted to the left somewhat. But I am creating a fairly broad valley, it's a fairly strong stretch on a linear image. And I am, that's what I'm doing to the histogram. So I can change SP, I can change B, I can change D. Now I'm going to go on to this first parameter, which is called LP. And it's the, it says LP, I call it low lights protection. It's labeled here as protect shadows. But what it does, it starts off at 0. And as I move it to the right, very slowly at first, but then it sort of gathers steam as I move it further to the right, it actually linearizes, makes this a straight line to the left of LP, and it adds contrast. You can see it's raising up a bit, it's getting steeper. So it's adding contrast back on this left-hand side. Well, where is it taking it from? Because our total contrast is the same. It's taking it from primarily where the area is flattest, up here and somewhere here. So it's actually reserving contrast from the rest of the image and keeping it to the left of LP. So what this has an effect on brightness, of course, because I'm actually brightening the whole image by doing that. And you can see the histogram start to shift to the right. Now, there's a couple of important stopping points that I'd like to point out along the way as I increase LP. The first one is where the max point SP, the point of maximum contrast, where this is steepest, actually coincides where it crosses the identity curve. What that means is the bottom of my valley is right below my point of maximum contrast addition. So there's no overall brightening or darkening of this point. I should have kept the preview opening as I was doing that. So I'll just back off to see how this is changing the preview. So I'm going to back off. Here's with no LP. As I move it to the right, it starts, you see it start brightening on the left-hand side of the image as I'm raising it and adding contrast there. And you can see the contrast come to the left-hand side till I reach a point where my contrast add crosses, where my my stretch crosses the identity line at the same point as SP. Now that's somewhere, I'm guessing here on my preview, but I can turn the preview on and off. And I can see that point is right here. Remember, I form quite a bit of a line when I add a bunch of contrast. But you can see its brightness is not changing when I turn the preview on and off. So that's one stopping point. As I continue up towards my SP point, I'll reach a point where I've linearized the plot to the extent that below my LP point, it actually is the identity line. And that means I haven't changed any of the pixels back here. You can actually see they're a flat line, just like they were originally. All my stretch is taking place up here. There's a little bit of valley still being formed to the left of SP, but most of the stretch is taken to the right of SP. My valley is now to the right of SP because now I'm brightening the whole image. But if I turn the preview on and off, you see I actually haven't changed any of the pixels from my LP point here all the way to the left. They remained unchanged. This is kind of handy if I'm doing if I've done a lot of work on the darks and I don't want to change them at all. I just have to use LP to make sure it goes over the identity line, and I can stretch up here whatever I want. And finally, I can move, the last stopping point is when I move LP all the way up to SP. At that point, the slope has been increased off the identity line. So I've increased the contrast back here because it's steeper than the identity line. And it's actually the same steepness as is defined by my LP, at my SP point. Now this will come in handy in a few minutes. It may not be apparent. The good news is that HP does the exact same thing except from the other side. And I can use some degree of LP and SP simultaneously if I really want to contain where I'm doing the stretch on the image. Does that all make sense? So now I've got all these things, these tools. That ends the first part of the presentation. And now I'm going to go on to some examples. So I know it's been a lot in a short period of time. I'm looking at my time and I'm kind of running out of it. But are there any questions at this stage?
Yeah, just it's a great presentation, and I want to say that what I got from it was, first of all, I'm sort of intuitively, I did a lot of the same sort of things, just learning it by doing. But what I felt was interesting was that what your program does, which you can't do in anything else in Pixinsight, is kind of like what we used to say in Photoshop, putting an S-curve into that histogram. But you can't put that S-curve into that histogram when it's linear, because it's so small you can't see it. So what in a sense, because you can visualize that small linear histogram, you then can put the symmetry point into it and then to enhance the contrast. And there's no other way of doing that in Pixinsight. So I thought that was the way I understood intuitively what was going on. So I think that's a great thing. But the one thing I was hoping you could say some more about was how you use that log visualization as opposed to linear. I can see it, that it enhances the detail of the of the presentation or the visualization of the data. Is that how you primarily use it?
Yeah, I primarily use the log view, and I will address that in a few minutes. I'm going to show you a bunch of examples and it'll become apparent. I'll actually show you the character of the log view histogram that you should perhaps aim for in your stretches and then in your refinements.
Great. Let me just say one last thing briefly, that I was taught to make sure that you get rid of as much noise as you could before you do any stretching. So one of the things I've been doing with GHS is to do noise exterminator on the linear image before I hit it with GHS, because otherwise what you're going to do is you're going to stretch the noise. So that's just my comment. But if you have any comments about that, I think that's a reasonable strategy, because your histogram is tighter to start with.
Yeah, I actually do it before and after.
Yeah, true.
But just
you'll pick crud up afterwards too.
Yeah, just be the defaults in noise exterminator, to my opinion, are a bit high. So I never use 0.9 or whatever it recommends. I'm always using
0.85. Yeah.
Anyway,
I'll keep quiet. Thank you.
Okay, I am going to show you a little bit of post-stretch editing, and I'm going to use an image I downloaded just as an example. So this is a landscape black and white image, and I'm going to open up GHS, and here's the histogram associated with it. It's not, it doesn't have a big depth of resolution to the pixel brightnesses, but as they tell me in black and white photography, we want black and white pictures. We don't want gray and white pictures. And really, they add a lot of contrast. And this is for mood effects. But let's say I'm not interested in mood effects in this image. Maybe I'm more interested in what's there. Maybe I'm from another planet. Because, being a human and seeing scenes like this, we can fill in a lot of details in our mind. But let's say I'm not sure what this shiny blob is, and it's kind of oval. We know it's the sun. What I can click on that point in the image, and it actually tells me that this point is actually overexposed. It's over on the right. So it's not overexposed, it's saturated. Those pixels are saturated. But let me put some contrast in that sun, and I want to do it in a manner that tells me some of the details that are going on in the sun. So I'm going to move my FB all the way to the right. I usually do that. You don't have to do that, but it really makes the stretch focused. And I want to move SP all the way to the right because I want the maximum contrast to be added on the far right-hand side. So I can do that by clicking on SP, it'll send it to 1, or I can move the slider over there. So let's add some stretch to this image. And let's put the preview on, which I keep forgetting to do. Now this is darkening the image, but it's adding a lot of contrast right in the sun where I want it. But I really don't want to darken the whole image. So I pick up my SP factor and I bring it up. So I don't let it take that much contrast away from the rest of the image. It is kind of taking it evenly across the entire image and putting it right here near where the sun is. I might want to make that a little bit more dramatic. And when I do that, and I can zoom in to I can actually get some detail. I can see there's maybe some clouds. Maybe I'm zoomed in a little bit too much, but I can see some clouds below the position of the sun, and above this, it's kind of squaring it off. So I've learned something about that by applying this kind of stretch to an image. Now, this is actually the shape of this curve is actually handy if you happen to have some saturated stars and you're overstretching the stars. This is a good way to recover some contrast in your brightest points. But I can apply that to my image. Well, let me undo that because I don't want to apply it to that image. I want to make a, where's it go? Oh, I get rid of this. Click on here. What's it done? Well, I guess it's not going to work. So I'll apply that to this image then. I've been doing that. Why has it stopped working? Because that's why I have a backup. Something going on. Oh my goodness. That wasn't supposed to happen. Does anyone tell me what I'm doing wrong here? Did I change my view?
No, that's when I restart Pixinsight.
Yeah, you don't want to wait for this thing to reload though.
Check your other desktop, maybe it is there in that.
Pardon me?
Check your other work area, right? You're in the second work area, probably get to the first one.
I can't hear you.
The work area, the workspace, you go to the other one. You're in the second desktop workspace, right? Yeah, in Pixinsight.
He's responding.
You're on a different screen than you started from, I think. I think you want to be on the one on the left, all the way on the left at the bottom. No, yeah, there.
Oh,
That-
no, it's not responding. I think something's gone awry. What I can do is reload this.
Yeah. You gotta love Windows 11, boy. How they could do that to us.
Yeah. You have 2 Pixinsight updates. Click here to select. No, I don't want them. Okay. This is going to take all my time away. It's a big project. So are there any questions in the meantime? What I was going to show you, maybe I'll skip that example, is that I could show a lot more details in that image that you couldn't see from the original image that was posted that I got off the web. Now,
You know, I had a comment for you that I don't know if you're familiar with Ansel Adams' zone system, but Ansel had a zone system with, believe it or not, 11 grayscales. And his goal in life, in his compositions, was to have equal amounts of grayscale in each one of the 11 zones. That's why he did all his dodging and burning and whatnot he used to do with film. And I thought that was interesting because in a sense, that's what you're aiming for with that logarithmic scale, where you're trying to get those, you're trying to get that histogram sort of evened out. Anyway, that's what Ansel would have said.
well, yeah, I don't know the details of that, but what I do see is this: make your black and white images black and white, not gray and white. If you do so, if you start adding a whole bunch of contrast on the edges where it is black and it is white, then you start making the whole image gray. By redistributing that contrast in that way, you will
Yeah, so what he said,
you will. But if you look in, say, Lightroom, what it says is it has 5 sliders right at the top. The first one is exposure. And I look at exposure, I don't know what transform it's doing, but I think it's doing a stretch with SP at 0. It's doing a gentle stretch, one with like a negative B being applied, and it's brightening the whole image without really drastically changing the contrast anywhere. The next slider down is the contrast slider. And what I think this is doing is putting contrast right in the middle. The next slider down, I think, is highlights, which is putting contrast sort of on around 0.75, and then there's a low lights that's putting at 0.25, say, and then there's a whites and a blacks. And I think whites is putting contrast really high, not quite at 1, but and blacks is putting it in the very darks. And so they end up with, 6 sliders in total, doing what I'm trying to do with the SP slider and the histogram transform and the GHS transform. So it's kind of the same thing presented differently, but it's a mystery exactly what Lightroom or Photoshop is doing. Marching along here.
David, one thing that I noticed, like you make this analogy between, well, in Photoshop, it's called shadow highlight. So it's very, very similar to what you're doing here. But the thing I found with shadow highlight is that you can very quickly introduce posterization where you shift the colors and they don't make sense anymore. I don't notice you doing that here. You see, either you're just methodically going through it to prevent that, or there's something where you're preventing it from going overboard in one area versus another.
Yeah. I think by the time this loads up, I'm going to run out of time to show you a lot of examples that I had hoped.
But David, it sounds like once you get to know the tool, you can probably look at the beginnings of an image and probably know more or less what you're going to do, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, well,
You've come to understand it.
Once you get that, I was actually talking to Steve. Maybe I can come back and at a future date and show more examples on how to do this.
Yeah, I would certainly support that. This is, I'm spending a lot of time with this tool, and I've spent a lot of time, and I think I really basically understand the first 3 sliders.
Yeah. In terms
But
of
David also seems like you can, as you say, these processes are invertible, right? You can actually go back and forth quite easily. And you don't lose anything by the process of doing it. You don't have to start back at 0, right? Because you
No.
can undo these things, right?
You don't. Now, if you get the initial stretch really bad, you can undo it, but it takes probably a lot more time than going back. You undo everything you've done, but usually it takes a lot less time is trying a different set of parameters for your initial stretch, because that's the most violent stretch that you're actually going to do. Now, hopefully, you know what, I'm going to skip this load.
It seems to me that if you make the first, if you don't overdo the first stretch, you can come back and stretch it a little bit more. Whereas if you overdo it to start with, then you've made gone a little bit too far, and you may pay the price later. So you can always stretch it more, but you can't take the stretch away.
Oh, you certainly can.
Yeah, you said that, David, didn't you say it was non-clippable? So basically, you can't destroy it, basically. You can go backwards if you want, right?
You just have to check that box, hit invert, and it will generate the transform that inverts the one you just did. So it's not a go back. It's an actual transform that it reapplies to your image.
It's an inverse function. It's an inverse function.
It's an inverse in the mathematical sense, inverse, not in the picture inverse. It's not doing that. And I was going to show you, and I thought I had boarded this. It says abort requested. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I apologize to everyone that this happened. I don't even know if it's fixed yet.
David, one thing I noticed, like when you started off with the primitive images, that was actually quite useful to me, rather than just doing it to a image that we're familiar with, right? Because you can really see GHS working.
Yeah, you get the theory.
Yeah.
David, can you actually set up 2 SP points in it, or you just reapply it twice?
I could have set up 2 SP points. You could actually set up a SP point that picks the place for the contrast to be minimized. Now you can do that by, that's what the invert image does. SP becomes the point where the contrast is minimized, because it's taking away the contrast where you just added it, essentially. But I was afraid that that was going to get too confusing.
David, just a quick question. With all these transformations that you're doing, do you keep a history inside of GHS of what you're doing?
No. Pixinsight keeps a history for you. So you can pick view the history and pick the image that you're interested in, and it'll tell you what the processes were applied to that image. And it'll also tell you the values of those inputs that you use at that particular time.
Yeah, so you'll be able to see the parameters that you used at every push of an execution, right?
You can drag it out of that history view and place it on your desktop so that you can use it directly, or even
Yeah, so you would basically have a function with parameters built into it that you could just launch or use.
How many clicks? Are you still there?
Yep.
As we have a little pause here, one thing that's been interesting me was I've gotten out into the outer limits with this program, and is applying it to different colors separately, and that's really the Wild West of trying to get this thing to work. Because if you do narrow band imaging and you get these colors that are really not natural, they can be not terribly well harmonized, and it can be very tricky. At least in my hands, it's very tricky to try to create something that's harmonious and stretched at the same time. Because you just imagine hydrogen alpha and O3 images, well, you know, they're really coming from 2 different points in space, so to speak. And it's very hard to get those curves to line up. This thing can do it, but I think my experience is what I'm trying to do is to do the 2 curves separately.
I'll show you an example. So this is an SHO image.
Great.
Right? That I just put SHO together. It's basically raw. I haven't done any. I might have done DBE on individual channels, but let's open up GHS here.
Yeah, this is really where the rubber meets the road.
So when I zoom in on the left-hand side, here are my 3. This is a log view. You can see there's data everywhere, but here they are in the standard view. So obviously this isn't color balanced. Green is actually hydrogen alpha, and it's dominating this image. So I really want these to line up. And there was there's a good video on how to do this on our website. But essentially, let's say I want to pick the green as to where the hydrogen alpha, where I want to line up these other two colors. So to line up the red, I can click up out here, right? I want to apply, doesn't really matter, I'll apply a big B factor, and I can stretch this D, and I'm going to zoom out a little bit more. I'm going to apply a stretch to just red. So you see just red has been stretched. And I can stretch it as, you know, off to the right. But then I'm going to use that HP to bring it back. So here it comes back again. And now I can really fine tune this. Now this has had an STF with the colors locked on it. So it was locked on the basis of not stretching one color less. So this is actually what I'm doing to the color. So you now see I've stretched the red and I see some stretch. I see some red in my image. I can leave it there, but I can now fine tune that HP. So bring it down so that maybe that's, I need to leave it a little bit stronger. I can fine tune it to put it right over the green column, right? I can take the blue and I can just this time set LP. I can apply that, sorry, apply that. I don't want to do it again, so I'm going to turn that off. But I can shrink the blue by putting SP all the way to the 1. Start applying some stretch. Now it's going to, oh, I got to click on just blue. I can stretch it down and then you use SP, use LP, sorry, to bring it back up. Well, you have to use this one first. So I can bring it back in the neighborhood. Oops. And then fine tune, bring it back in the neighborhood, then fine tune LP to put it right where I want it. And there I've color calibrated that image. Now I can do it a little bit fancier. Take off this stretch. I can do it a little bit fancier, but then I start going into my standard stretch routines. Now I would, at this point, I would extract the luminosity and then stretch the luminosity separate from the color, because all these fancy Jedi tricks, HDMRT and LHE, they're going to create color artifacts. So what I do is I separate that into a color image and luminance image. I make both starless. Then I can do deconvolution on my starless luminance, and deconvolution on the starless image is just the cat's meow. It's easy to use. I don't have to worry about any of that ringing stuff. I don't have to do masking necessarily. On a starless luminous image, it's just the best. I have to get my PSF function before I remove the stars. On the color image, I would normally stretch this without the stars, but gives me a lot more flexibility. So I'm probably going to overstretch the stars when I'm doing this, but I'm going to pick my SP. I'm back to an RGB stretch, pick my SP, send to SP, and use a big B and start to stretch it onto the right, zoom out, undo my screen transfer function, and eventually you'll see now I'm really bifurcating here. So I'd actually do this in 2 steps. I would go this far. Adjust my SP, so I'm separating the nebulosity from the background, but it's kind of all over the place. So, damn it, what am I doing? It's all over the place. What do I do? SP. Stretch. Here. I don't want to bifurcate, but we'll accept that for now. But because the magic actually happens. Oh, set this 0. The magic actually happens. I'll look at it in log view. At this stage, so my colors are kind of still balanced in the darks, but my green is dominated. So I might want to actually stretch the green first as a second stretch. Set my SP. I've got a bit of a bump here. I always want to put my SP on top of bumps. That's how I get rid of bumps. That was the point of that example I showed you earlier. And let's say I want to stretch green. I want to move SP up. So this is kind of the shape that you generally want, not exactly in your log histogram. You want to go up to a peak, maybe across a bit. If your nebulosity is melded with the black background, you go down from the peak, then you'll hit an almost constant flat traverse and dropping down to the bottom. If I see this go up, I'm bloating the stars somewhat. If some of these features might be absent, some might be present, but let's say I'm okay with that for my green. I can apply that. But I want some more red in there in this image. So I can pick a place for the red and stretch that red separately from the green. Now, I know green is going to be the dominant color, so I don't really want to go past that green, but a little stretch of red starts to bring red into the image. Now, really, what am I doing by stretching red is now I'm stretching my sulfur. So it had the weakest signal to noise ratio. So I might be increasing the noise in my image by doing that, right? Actually, in this particular image, which is the Christmas tree cluster and the fox fur, oxygen is the weakest signal, and that's why it's so peaky. So I can pick a point here, and I haven't been that careful in this demo, but I can stretch it separately too. Give it its own SP. Oh, pick
You want to
quality and start stretching it as well. So it's got the weakest, and you can start to see some blue appearing in parts of the image. So then once I've done that, I can go and take my luminance file. So now I've got some reds and some blue, and I could have overdone it. This is actually a preview. Could have overdone it a little bit, but you know, in 2 seconds, this is what I've done. I've actually got my luminance. Here's my luminance image that I did for this. So this is with all the Jedi mind tricks done with it. So if you've got a Hubble palette image such as this, and you still want to remove some greens, the next, if you go to the LRGB combination tool, you can pick my luminance file. At least normally I can. Sorry. Pick my luminance file. Turn these off. But in this color weights, I can weight green a little bit less. And this is, you have to do a little experimentation here. Let's say I want to weight green a little bit less, but preserve the take my color stretched image, apply it to that. It will impose that luminance that I just did upon my RGB image, but it'll only it'll reduce the green contribution by 90% while preserving the luminance. And this will additionally take some green out of the image for a more Hubble palette-like result. And it finally figures out what to do. The last percentage is always the longest. So really, don't be afraid to stretch your individual colors. Again, if I go into the History Explorer, you have to watch your color balance in the background. Like I've increased red, but I can use the LP slider to make sure that that adjustment is made. What are you thinking about? There we go. Now I've buggered up the stars. I got way too much magenta in the stars, but now I've decreased the green in the image. I've brought out some red areas and some blue areas. It's very noisy because I may have overstretched my weak signal to noise of my blue channel and my red channel. I can then invert the image and make use of SCNR to remove green. Usually picks maximum neutral. To remove green from the inverted image, that's taking out the magentas from the original image, and then invert again. And I've got, a reasonable color palette view of the same thing. So that's without directly applying SCNR to remove green. Now the colors can get muddy, especially in this image, which is really difficult because it is so hydrogen alpha dominated. And I'll show you another trick with, if I have time, with the Hercules cluster. And Mike is mainly responsible for this, but I'm going to stretch this with the standard methodology that I was going to show you earlier, but I zoom in on the left-hand side. If I've got a big gap here, I don't want to waste contrast in here. And by looking at the log view, I can tell there are no pixels in here. So I can do a quick, by selecting linear in my transformation type, I can send this to the black point, execute that, and change the black point. Now, the black point is one of those places where you have to be careful. If you pick any pixels within your black point, I am changing the 1 and 0. If I pick any pixels, I'll do clipping, but I know I haven't clipped in this stage because I saw there were no pixels where I picked it, so I'm okay. And when I do return the STF. Now, initially, this is noisy background, and there's actually nothing in the background of interest, but I can pick my SP point, zoomed in right on my histogram peak. I generally start with my B all to the left. I start my stretch, zoom out, and we can not look at the log view for now, and put my peak where I want. And let's take a look at the preview of this. That's the STF applied. So now I can see I've kind of got this grayish background showing. If I hone in on SP here, using the highest sensitivity, I can see I can push that background into the black and get my image. Now, you can see I've got that classic shape. I go up the bump, down the bump, and then almost a linear, in log view, a linear slope, and then a cliff at the end. Now I can modify that. I might actually take some B away because I got some room for the stars there. So I can brighten the stars. If I want to see, I zoom into the core of my cluster here to make sure I can still resolve the stars. If I back off B too much, I start blowing it out. So I want to keep a good amount of contrast. I want that cliff fairly close to the right-hand side to use all my contrast. Undo that. I can zoom into this galaxy too and see what that looks like if I want. It's got quite some interesting features, but the colors have been washed out. So a lot of people would want to use the arc shine stretch to get those color back. And Mike has built in here a way that does the exact same thing as the arc shine stretch does, is it actually stretches the luminance and then applies that luminance stretch to the individual colors. That way saturation isn't lost when I stretch. And so now I get some vivid colors. If I go back into that nice galaxy that I had, I can really see some color detail as well as the detail itself. Now, this can cause some clipping to occur when I convert from when I do these color blend options. I can control the colors, so you just have to be aware of that. So you have to watch for artifacts. And I can change the color blend that I'm doing by blending it back in with a luminance stretch. So if I don't like, if it's too vibrant, I put it there. And if I move it to the right, I get the full vibrancy. Now, I generally don't do it this way, but it is a great handy feature. And sometimes I do it this way, but usually not. What I do is I go back to my RGB stretch and apply it. And then I take my RGB stretch and I just stretch saturation. Now, when I'm stretching saturation, I like to use a negative B because it's a gentle stretch and it's more like that arc shine stretch. In fact, minus 1.4 is the arc shine stretch for all intents and purposes. And I can stretch saturation. You can see as I stretch saturation, I get the colors in my image. I get the star colors in my image more and more. And again, you do it to taste. So that's more for an RGB image. Now, the most recent stuff we've been doing, I don't want to do it again, so take that off. Now I can again get those vibrant colors in that galaxy. And in, let me do it here. Well, I've already stretched it, I think. I can zoom into the core and I get my nice blue stars and my nice red, yellow, orange stars too. So I can keep giving you examples. I know we're kind of running out of time. I think, have we lost most of our participants? We have many with us.
Hardcore here still, but I was wondering if you could just review for one second. That's very good stuff you're doing there. Just one thing I missed was you moved the histogram to the left when you started out to get into that dark area, and I sort of missed what you did when you did that.
Okay, so what I'm doing is the equivalent of moving the outside sliders on the histogram transform.
Yeah.
So,
but how do you do that in your program? I'm sorry, I'm
okay.
So I don't know how to do it though.
So if you look, I don't know how well you can see this, but there's a histogram type, transformation type selection bar. The first one is mid-tone transfer. So this is the same nonlinear stretch as histogram transform, except with B taken out. So it's really internally just setting B to 0 and letting you continue on. Similarly, the arcsine stretch is doing the arcsine stretch. There's no B in this one because you can't change B in arcshine. They're both family members of the generalized hyperbolic equations, if you will. The last one is a linear stretch. Now this has been taken out because it's too many parameters on one screen for one thing. But second of all, it doesn't follow all those rules. When I'm doing a linear stretch here, I can move the black point. And you can see when I'm moving the black point, it no longer goes from 0, 0, it goes up here. If I look what that's doing to my image, I'm actually clipping pixels. So I can't say that I'm not hurting the data. In fact, I'm really hurting the data. And if I actually wasn't hurting the data, a linear stretch actually doesn't really look that great. It does for part, but if you take a linear image and stretch it linearly, you're going to end up clipping pixels and it's going to look horrible. So for those reasons, we kind of separated in this little function, but it is good to do an initial black point stretch because this is contrast. If I add this contrast to this point, it's kind of wasted contrast.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And I don't want to waste contrast out there. So I can, by looking at a log view, one thing it does show is actually where that black point is, because I don't see any pixels there. And if I don't see them on the log view, then they're not there. So I can just pick my yellow line, just make sure it's to the left of my data. Oh, I've got to pick the linear transform. Just to the left of my data, send it to the black point, and you can see it's just done a linear stretch and clipping where there are no pixels anyway, so I'm not harming the image, and then just applying that to the image. Now, I can do that another way. Let me zoom in here.
I think you said you used a low clip on that in linear at one point.
Yeah, you can use the low clip. That tells you how many pixels you're actually clipping. So, you can just use it. Sorry. You can just use it to check that that's 0. But you could still be clipping pixels in the low. I like to use the log view. You can use whichever one you want to use. Right, but it'll tell you what percentage you're clipping if you go too far. Okay, what's a good way to showing this? You can see my final image. Pick that as the active image and look at the preview. Let's reset this. Can I stretch it? Oh, I'm zoomed in. There we go. So after all my stretching, I've still exaggerated that bit to the left-hand side. So let me zoom in a little bit. So I can do this in a non-clipping manner by setting SP there, doing a healthy stretch. I set SP, doing a healthy stretch, a little bit of a stretch, and then bring my HP point down. And you can see I have to set SP where I want the black point to be. So I want the black point to be there. But I'm not setting the black point, I'm setting SP. Conduct some stretch. And bring HP. Why is SP there? Send to SP. And bring my HP down. What am I doing wrong? Sorry. I'm going to send SP at that point. So now with some fine tuning, I've actually moved the histogram to the left. Like do it more if I set SP up there. And then move HP back. I've actually done my black point without actually clipping the data. You can see I'm actually shrinking the image at this point. And with my HP almost down to my LP, I'm really only expecting, oops. Oh, I put it much too high. What have I done wrong? I'm doing something wrong. I'm too frazzled.
David, this is Steve. We've just passed 2 hours.
Yeah.
I
I'm good.
think we should leave some of these problems for another night. Let's try to see if we could do something in the future. I think this has been fascinating. You've certainly piqued everybody's interest, and you have taught a lot of people a lot of things. I sure got a better view of it tonight, and I appreciate that. If there are any
I apologize for the computer glitch.
this happens, David. It's happened to me. Luckily, nobody was watching when it happened to me, but it has. If I think it's probably time that we should wrap this up. if there's anybody who hasn't asked a question, who's got a last minute question, I would take that. David, do you have any wrap up?
Yeah, I just had basically a thank you slide that I don't think I have access to. Thank you all for attending. Please go to the GHSAstro.com or .co.uk site. Take a look. There's been lots of videos so you can see other examples. I think there's quite a big following, and I want to make sure that Mike has a point to say anything if he's still with us.
Thanks. I've been in and out on the internet actually, so it's been a bit of a challenge at this end. But no, I'll leave it there because I know we're short of time.
Okay, please give it a try. And you know, it might not come to you the first time you open it up, but there's lots of videos to watch and help. And if you folks want me back again, I can certainly come back and maybe we can jump right into some of the videos. Some examples of, sorry.
I myself would certainly be in favor of that. And I see we've got a hard core that has stayed. So I know that there's a lot of interest. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
It's been a great presentation, and we'll solve the rest of the world's problems on another day. Let's I ask everybody to unmute themselves, and a moment of applause is in order. If you can unmute.
There you go. Have a good day.
Thanks.
Thanks so
very
much.
Okay.
We'll see you.
Thank
We'll
you.
see everybody next month, and hope to have David back on another night.
Sounds great.
Thanks very much.
Thank
Night.
you.